My name is Margaret Hensley. I am 68 years old, and tonight was supposed to be the beginning of a quieter chapter in my life, a farewell to the decades I spent teaching literature to classrooms full of eager and not so eager faces. My colleagues had gathered, the ones who still remained from the early years, and the younger teachers who looked at me with that mixture of admiration and relief that comes when someone else finally reaches the finish line. My oldest friends were here too, the ones who had known me since long before the title Mrs. Hensley was ever spoken, and of course my family had filled the hall, each of them smiling with pride, or at least the sort of pride they thought they ought to display. I wore a deep blue dress, one my daughter had chosen for me, though it was my daughter-in-law who drew the most attention, gliding through the room with that sharp beauty that never warmed but instead seemed to cut. She wore a red dress, bold and almost daring, her eyes darting toward me with an expression I had long ago stopped trusting. As the speeches were made and the toasts began, I tried to let the nostalgia settle around me like a soft shawl, the laughter and memories wrapping me in comfort. But something in the pit of my stomach felt unsettled, like a violin string pulled too tight. She came to me then, my daughter-in-law, holding 2 glasses of wine, her smile stretched wide, too rehearsed, too careful, and she extended one toward me with a flourish that seemed better suited to a stage than a family gathering. Perhaps to anyone else, it was a small gesture, but I had learned over years of watching her to notice the details, the small flick of her wrist, the way her eyes lingered on the glass, just a fraction longer than natural, the faintest tremor of anticipation that crossed her lips before she placed the stem between my fingers. I have lived a long life observing people, and there was something about that moment that chilled me beneath the warmth of all the applause and chatter. It should have been a night of gratitude and celebration, a night to look back on what I had built and forward to the peace I had earned. But instead, as I held that delicate glass and looked into the eyes of the woman who had married my son, I felt an unease that no words of congratulations could soothe, as though the wine itself carried a secret only I was meant to discover. As I lifted the glass closer to my lips, something caught my eye, subtle and fleeting, yet as unmistakable as a shadow that does not belong to the light. At the bottom of the pale red wine, where the reflections of the chandelier should have danced smoothly, I saw a faint swirl, a ripple like smoke curling underwater, dissolving into the liquid in slow, deliberate patterns. My heart clenched, not from age but from recognition, a quiet alarm that whispered louder than the laughter filling the hall. I had raised children. I had taught hundreds of students. I had lived long enough to know the difference between chance and intention, and nothing about that cloudy thread sinking into my drink felt accidental. My gut twisted as though something inside me was pulling me back from the brink, warning me that what I held was not a toast to honor my years, but a quiet weapon wrapped in sweetness. She thought I would not notice, that my aging eyes would gloss over the detail, that I would simply sip and smile and make her life easier. Yet I did notice, and in that instant, my instincts sharpened, with the clarity of glass struck by sudden light. I remembered her smile as she handed it to me, stretched wide as if it was stitched into place, her gaze watching too intently for a reaction, and it all aligned with frightening precision. She wanted me to drink. She wanted me dulled or worse. I did not yet know the reason, whether it was greed, resentment, or a hunger for control. But the intent pulsed like a drumbeat inside me, steady and undeniable. Around me the celebration roared on, the voices of my friends and family weaving together into a tapestry of joy, and no one saw the quiet battle taking shape in my hands. I steadied my breathing, let my face soften into a mask of contentment, and thanked her with a nod, as though nothing at all was amiss. The wine shimmered with menace beneath the crystal rim, and I realized that tonight was not simply about retirement or endings, but about survival. What she thought would slip past me had instead awakened every watchful instinct I had honed over a lifetime, and I knew in that moment that I would not drink what was meant for me. I lifted the glass with what I hoped looked like unshakable gratitude, the kind of gentle smile a mother-in-law ought to wear when a daughter-in-law makes such a thoughtful gesture, though inside my chest, my heart hammered so violently, I feared it might give me away. The swirl had almost disappeared now, dissolving into the wine until only I knew what had been hidden there. But the knowledge sat heavy, a secret between my eyes and the glass, and I felt the weight of it in every nerve. She turned her head for a moment, distracted by someone calling her name from across the room, and in that single heartbeat of opportunity, I acted. Years of experience in classrooms, in raising children, in reading people, had taught me that survival often depends not on force, but on timing, on knowing precisely when to move, and with the grace of someone who has rehearsed caution all her life, I placed her glass in front of me and slid mine into her waiting hand. It was such a small movement, nearly invisible in the swirl of party chatter, the clink of silverware and music humming in the background. Yet it felt monumental, as though the air itself shifted in recognition of the switch. When she turned back, her eyes flickered toward me, expecting, waiting, and I lifted the glass she believed was mine to my lips, but let it rest there, barely touching. Then I set it down again, feigning distraction, letting her sip instead from the one she had meant for me. Her smile was bright for only a second, but I caught it falter, the curve of her lips quivering like fabric pulled too tight. My pulse pounded so hard I thought the sound must be echoing in my ears, yet outwardly I remained the image of calm. A woman enjoying her evening, a mother celebrating the culmination of a long career. I felt a strange satisfaction bloom in me, sharp and cold, knowing that the power she thought she held had slipped like sand through her fingers and settled firmly into my own. Around us, the party carried on, unaware of the quiet war being fought with nothing more than crystal and poisoned powder. But I knew the first victory had been mine. At first, it was almost imperceptible, the kind of discomfort one might dismiss as a passing headache, or the faint dizziness from too many glasses of wine. But I saw it, because I was waiting, because my eyes were trained only on her as the laughter and speeches carried on around us like waves against the shore. She lifted her hand to her temple, fingertips pressing lightly as though she were trying to steady herself, her smile holding but just barely, the edges twitching with the strain of maintaining her performance. To anyone else, she looked radiant, the dutiful daughter-in-law beaming through my retirement party, but I caught the tiny crack in her mask, the way her jaw tightened, and her lips pressed together with a sudden tension that had nothing to do with joy. It was in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that the poison she had so carefully prepared had found its way back to her. The orchestra of celebration continued in full measure. Friends and family clinking glasses, recounting memories of my years in the classroom, stories that warmed the room with nostalgia, yet I felt separate from it all. Sitting in a private theatre where only one performance mattered, each flicker of discomfort that crossed her face was like a curtain lifting, exposing her truth for me alone to see, and I watched with a satisfaction that was quiet and steady, not the wild glee of triumph, but the solemn recognition of justice beginning its work. My pulse slowed, no longer frantic as it had been during the switch, but measured, calm, assured, like a metronome, finally keeping the rhythm I had set. She glanced my way once, her eyes searching for something, perhaps a confirmation that I had not noticed, perhaps reassurance that she still held control, but I met her gaze evenly and allowed a soft smile to rest on my lips, one she could interpret however she wished. The room roared with toasts to my health, to my future, to the legacy of my career. And though I nodded politely and thanked them, the real toast was already taking place in silence. A toast she had poured for me and instead delivered to herself. Watching her shift in her seat, her face pale beneath the bright light, I thought to myself that this was only the beginning. The first sign that the power she believed she wielded had been shattered by her own hand. As I sat there, pretending to laugh at a story one of my colleagues was telling, my eyes drifted back to her, and with them came a flood of memories I had tried to ignore for months, shadows that had gathered slowly in the corners of my family. I remembered the subtle insults she wrapped in silk, compliments that cut instead of comforted, the way she would smile sweetly while remarking on how tired I looked, how outdated my ideas seemed, how fortunate my son was to have found someone with such modern sensibilities. She was clever enough never to strike directly, but each remark was a pinprick, leaving marks invisible to anyone else but burning on my skin long after the conversation ended. I thought of the condescending sighs she gave whenever I spoke about my teaching, about the generations of students who had passed through my classroom, their letters of gratitude tucked into a box she once called a shrine to irrelevance. I recalled the way she began to pull my son away from me, one small step at a time, filling his calendar with obligations that excluded me, convincing him that his family should be the one he was building now and not the one that had raised him. When I questioned it, he would say she only wanted peace, but I knew better. I remembered the sharp arguments over inheritance, the sudden obsession she developed with what I planned to do with the modest savings, and the house that had been mine for 40 years. Her voice always dripping with false innocence, as she insisted she was only thinking of the future. Beneath it all, I saw now the contempt she carried for me, a disdain so carefully hidden under charm and duty that it might have fooled anyone who did not know how to look. Tonight, as she pressed her hand to her temple and tried to hold her smile in place, all the fragments of suspicion clicked together into a cruel mosaic. And I understood with terrifying clarity. She did not simply dislike me. She wanted me gone, removed from her path the way one clears a piece from a chessboard, tidy and final, so she could reshape my son's life and claim what I had spent decades building. That glass she placed in my hand had been the culmination of her months of whispers, manipulations, and schemes. And instead of falling into her trap, I was watching her stumble into her own. It was midway through the evening when the cracks she had been trying so desperately to conceal finally widened into a collapse, subtle at first, like the faltering note of a violin before the string snaps, but then undeniable. She stood from her chair too quickly, her glass tilting in her hand, and for one terrifying second, it looked as though it would slip entirely from her grasp and shatter against the polished floor. A few nearby guests caught the movement and turned, their laughter dimming, their eyes narrowing with curiosity as the room shifted from celebration to discomfort. My son, always eager to protect, rushed forward, his hand at her elbow, his voice filled with confusion and alarm as he asked if she was all right. She gave a weak laugh, brushing it off as if she had simply stood too fast. But her skin had gone pale beneath the bright lights, and the red of her dress, her lips pressed thin against the tremor that rippled through her body. Whispers spread like a breeze across a field. Soft at first, then louder, the ripple of speculation winding around the tables as colleagues and relatives exchanged glances, wondering if the evening's honored guest had been overshadowed by a scene no one had expected. I sat still, my glass before me untouched, the wine catching the light like a ruby, my hands perfectly steady as though I were carved from stone. Inside, though, there was a storm, a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief that I, who had been marked as the target, now sat watching her falter under the weight of her own treachery. My son guided her back into her chair, his brow furrowed, his voice tight with concern, asking again and again if she needed air, if she wanted water, if he should call for help. She waved him off, insisting she was fine, though her voice lacked its usual command, and the tremor in her fingers betrayed her. I let the corner of my mouth curve into the faintest smile, small enough to be mistaken for politeness by those who glanced my way, but strong enough for me to feel the satisfaction of control humming inside me. The party carried on, though more subdued now. The mood thinned by worry, yet no one suspected the truth. Only I knew why her legs wavered, why her glass shook, why her mask was slipping, and only I felt the unshakable steadiness of a woman who had refused to drink the poison meant for her. I slipped quietly from the crowd, murmuring something about needing a moment, and no one questioned me, for I had earned the right to leave my own party whenever I pleased. The hallway was cooler, the noise of clinking glasses and chatter dimming into a muffled hum behind me, and for the first time that evening, I allowed the smile that had been trembling at the edges of my composure to spread across my lips. My reflection in the darkened window looked back at me, older, lined, but alive in a way I had not felt in years, alive because I knew what had just transpired in that room was not the accident she had wanted everyone to believe. I had seen her hand, the small movement of her fingers hovering too long over the glass, the way she shielded it with her body as if from some imagined draught, and I had seen the faint dust dissolve, swirling into the liquid with a patience that told me she thought herself clever. She believed I was blind to her designs, that age had dulled my senses and left me softened, unaware of the currents beneath the surface. But she underestimated me, as so many do when the hair turns silver and the hands grow slower. My life has been built on observation, on studying the unsaid, on noticing the gesture that betrays the intention, and she had handed me her crime in plain sight, confident I would never think to doubt her. The truth was that I had doubted her from the moment she entered my family, her smile, always just a fraction too polished, her eyes watching me with the hunger of someone weighing what they might gain when another is gone. Tonight, though, she revealed herself fully, thinking she had woven a perfect net while leaving holes wide enough for me to slip through and catch her in her own web. Standing there in the quiet hallway, I felt my heart steady, the earlier fear settling into something sharper, a steel resolve tempered by age and experience. I whispered to myself that the story of this night would not be hers to tell but mine. And though she had thought herself the author of my ending, I was cleverer, and the chapter she had written had already been rewritten by my hand. The house was silent after the last of the guests had gone, the echoes of laughter and clinking glasses fading into the night, until only the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the hallway clock remained. And in that silence I found her. She was slumped in the armchair by the fire, though the flames had long since died down, her skin pale and damp with sweat, strands of hair clinging to her forehead as she tried to compose herself. My son had gone upstairs, exhausted from the night's festivities, and unaware of the storm unraveling beneath his own roof, leaving the two of us alone in a space that no longer felt like home, but like a stage prepared for a truth, too heavy to remain hidden. I walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, and when I stopped beside her, I bent just enough so that my words would reach her ear alone. I told her I knew, that I had seen everything, the powder slipping into the glass, the false sweetness of her smile, the way she thought I would raise the wine to my lips and drink without question. I told her that I switched the glasses, that what she intended for me, she had delivered to herself, and with each word I spoke, I watched her face drain of color until she looked like a ghost still clinging to flesh. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed as though she might summon the energy to deny it. But her trembling hands betrayed her, clutching at the armrest as though she were grasping for control, slipping away. For a long moment she said nothing, and the silence pressed against us like a weight. The quiet acknowledgement that her secret had not only been exposed but turned against her. I straightened, allowing myself the faintest smile, not of cruelty, but of certainty, the kind of satisfaction that comes when the truth no longer hides in shadows. She shifted, opening her mouth as if to speak. But no words came, only the faint rasp of a breath that carried both fear and fury. In that moment I felt no pity, only a grim understanding that this confrontation was the beginning, not the end, and that she would never forget the night she tried to poison me, and instead discovered I was far less fragile than she believed. She let out a laugh that sounded brittle, a sound so thin it cracked before it left her lips, and she shook her head as though I were a foolish old woman mistaking shadows for shapes. She told me it was an accident, that the powder had been nothing more than vitamins she sometimes mixed into her drink, that I had misunderstood a simple moment in the flurry of the evening, but her voice wavered on the edges of each word, and her eyes, wide and darting, betrayed the story she was trying so desperately to weave. I stood there, watching her face the way a teacher watches a child stumble through a lie, and I felt the patience of years settle over me like a cloak, steady and impenetrable. I told her not to waste her breath, that the glass she had handed me was still sitting on the table with her fingerprints smeared on the stem, a quiet witness that would not lie no matter how much she twisted her tongue. I reminded her of how she hovered near me all night, how others had seen her lean too close, shield me from view as though she were performing some kindness, when in truth she was committing her crime under the illusion of generosity. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw clenched, and for a moment her mask cracked again, letting the fury beneath shine through before she pulled it back into a smile that looked like it hurt to hold. I pressed harder, my voice low but sharp, telling her that the noose she had tied for me was now looped firmly around her own neck, that every denial she attempted only tightened it further, until she would find herself trapped by the very rope she thought she controlled. She tried again to protest, to insist that I was being dramatic, but the sweat on her brow and the tremor in her hands betrayed her more than any words could. I leaned close, not to whisper this time, but to let her see that I was not afraid, that I had been underestimated for the last time, and in her silence, I heard the truth she could not speak. The game she had begun was already lost, and though she clawed for excuses, the walls were closing in, each reminder, each fact, each observation pulling tighter until she could barely breathe beneath the weight of her own deception. When I finally told my son the truth, it felt like splitting the ground open beneath his feet, and I could see the tremor of disbelief ripple through him, as though the very world he trusted had shifted. He looked at me first with confusion, then with something almost like fear, as if he worried I had imagined it all, that age or fatigue had clouded my judgment. But the steadiness in my voice held him where wild denial might have carried him away. I described what I had seen, how she lingered over the glass, how the powder had swirled in the wine, how I switched them and watched her drink what she had meant for me. At first he shook his head, insisting she would never, but then he glanced toward the room where she still sat pale and trembling, her hand pressed against her temple, her lips too weak to form the sharp words she usually wielded so easily. And I knew he was replaying every detail of the night against what I had told him. He tried to dismiss it as coincidence, to cling to the idea that his wife was simply ill, that nothing more sinister could possibly be lurking in the shadow of our celebration. But even as he said the words, his eyes betrayed him, clouded with doubt he could not push aside. I placed my hand over his, steady and calm, and reminded him of her hovering presence, the way she made certain only I received the glass from her hand, the way she watched me with a hunger that was not love but calculation. I told him there were witnesses who had seen her lean too close, too insistent, and that my untouched glass still sat on the table, pristine, a silent witness to my restraint. He tried to protest, but the memory of her collapse only hours earlier, the sudden sickness no one else had shared, was gnawing at his certainty, and I could see his mind working against itself, torn between the loyalty of a husband and the instincts of a son who had always known me to be careful and true. In that moment, the world cracked for him, jagged lines running through the life he had built. And though he could not yet say he believed me, he could no longer say he did not. And that fracture in his certainty was the first step toward the truth. I stood in the doorway, half hidden by the shadows of the hall, as my son confronted her, his voice taut with disbelief and anger, though beneath it, I heard the tremor of heartbreak. She lifted her chin and spun her words like silk, weaving lies with practiced ease, insisting that I had misunderstood, that my age and exhaustion had made me see things that weren't there, that she had been nothing but devoted to me and to him. Then she shifted, letting her voice break, her eyes well with tears that seemed to appear on command, her hands trembling as though she were the victim of a cruel accusation rather than the architect of a cruel design. She told him I had never accepted her, that I had resented her from the beginning, that I wanted to poison their marriage with my bitterness, now that I was no longer needed. Her performance would have fooled most, perhaps even him once. But I saw the hesitation in his face, the way his eyes flickered, not with certainty, but with doubt, because the seed I had planted was already sprouting in the soil of his memory. I could almost see him recalling the smaller moments he had dismissed before, the times she had turned him against me with whispers that I was meddling, the sudden excuses for why I could not join them for dinner, the way she convinced him that my presence made her uncomfortable, always shifting the blame until I looked like the intruder in my own family. I knew he remembered the inheritance arguments, her eagerness to know the details of what would someday be his, her impatience when I hesitated to discuss it, her voice coated in sugar but sharp beneath the surface. Now, as he looked at her pale face and trembling hands, he began to connect those scattered dots into a pattern he could no longer ignore. She reached for him, pleading, swearing that she loved him, that she would never harm me. But his eyes betrayed the storm within him, caught between the vows of a husband and the instincts of a son, who had begun to see the truth in my words. I watched him wrestle with the weight of it all, and I knew the foundation of their marriage had shifted, that doubt had cracked it open, and no matter how skillfully she tried to mend it with lies, the fracture would remain, widening with each memory that returned to him. I knew words alone would never be enough to break the hold she had over my son, not when her tears could flow on command and her voice could tremble with such perfect mimicry of sincerity. So I began to gather proof quietly, carefully, the way a gardener tends to seeds in secret soil, knowing that in time they would grow strong enough to stand on their own. The restaurant where the party had been held had cameras placed above the bar, their unblinking eyes capturing every exchange. And though the manager seemed reluctant at first, I pressed with the calm insistence of a woman who had nothing left to lose. And soon enough, I watched the footage for myself. There she was, leaning in close to the bartender, her hand hovering over two glasses as she shifted them toward herself, sprinkling something small and pale into only one before glancing around with the nervous dart of someone testing whether the world was watching. My heart pounded as I replayed it, not from surprise, but from the vindication of seeing in pixels what my eyes had already known in truth. When I spoke to the bartender, he recalled her insistence that he not deliver the drinks himself, her smile too sweet as she told him she wanted the honor of presenting the toast to me personally. His brow furrowed when I asked if that was unusual, and he admitted it was. But he had not thought much of it at the time. I thanked him, and though his testimony was not an official record, it was another thread in the rope I was braiding, a rope that would bind her lies tighter than she could wriggle free. The final piece came almost by accident, the kind of detail villains always overlook because arrogance blinds them to the possibility of failure. While she was distracted in her room, I found her purse carelessly left unzipped on the dresser, and tucked inside among her cosmetics was a small half-empty packet of powder, folded neatly as though it belonged there. My fingers trembled as I held it, not from fear but from the enormity of what it meant. The confirmation that the shadows I had seen were not figments of paranoia, but the edges of a very real blade she had aimed at me. I slipped it back without a word, the weight of certainty now mine to carry, and I knew the time for doubt had passed. It happened one evening when the air between us had grown too thick with silence to contain, when the lies she had spun and the doubts my son carried finally pressed her into a corner she could no longer escape. She had tried to keep up the charade, had tried to hold on to that mask of sweetness she wore so well, but the evidence I had gathered sat like a weight in the room, undeniable, and the tremor in her hands betrayed the fury that boiled beneath her skin. When I told her quietly that I had the security footage, that I had spoken to the bartender, that I had even found the half-empty packet hidden in her purse, her lips curled back into something that was no longer a smile but a snarl, and she lashed out with words so sharp they cut through the air like glass shattering on stone. She called me bitter, accused me of clinging to relevance, sneered that I had lived long enough and that my son's life would be easier without the anchor of a mother weighing him down. Her contempt dripped from every syllable, unfiltered now, revealing the greed that had driven her all along, her hunger for the house, the savings, the small but steady estate I had built with decades of sacrifice. She spat that she deserved it more than I did, that I was too old to enjoy it, that it should belong to them, to her, to the future she claimed she was building. I did not need to answer, for my son had entered the room in time to hear every word, his eyes wide as though he had walked into a nightmare he could no longer deny. She froze when she saw him, but the venom was still dripping from her tongue, impossible to pull back, impossible to erase. He stood there, silent, staring at the woman he thought he knew, and I watched as the last pieces of his loyalty cracked and fell away. The mask she had worn for years lay shattered at her feet, and all that remained was the cruel ambition that had nearly cost me my life. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a strange kind of peace, because he had heard it with his own ears, not from me, not from suspicion, but from her own mouth, and there would be no going back from that. The days that followed unfolded like the slow unraveling of a tapestry, each thread of their marriage loosening until what had once looked seamless was nothing more than a fragile weave coming apart in his hands. My son could no longer look at her the same way, for the words he had overheard clung to him like smoke, and every time she reached for him with trembling fingers, he pulled back, remembering the venom she had spilled without restraint. He asked her questions she could not answer, questions about the packet of powder, about the bartender, about the night of the party. And though she tried to weep and beg and insist I had twisted everything, the lies rang hollow now, their familiar sweetness replaced by a bitter aftertaste he could not stomach. In the neighborhood and among our friends, whispers began to spread, whispers that took on lives of their own, as they always do. Voices lowering in cafes and church pews, murmuring about the strange collapse of a daughter-in-law who had once shone so brightly at gatherings. Some remembered how she hovered too close with my glass. Others recalled how pale she had turned that night, And though no one had the full story, the fragments pieced together into a tale that did not favor her. Invitations grew fewer, smiles toward her less genuine, and the charm she once wielded like a weapon began to dull against the weight of suspicion. She had wanted me erased, my presence reduced to a memory. But instead, she was the one slowly disappearing, her reputation crumbling like plaster beneath rain. My son began spending more time with me, sometimes silent, sometimes full of regret for not having seen it sooner, and though I never said the words, I knew he carried guilt as heavy as stone. I told him it was not his fault, that deception thrives best in the blind spots of love. But I also knew he would never forgive her, and in that knowledge, I felt both sorrow and vindication. She had built her plan on cruelty and greed, convinced she was clever enough to outwit me. But in the end, her own mask had betrayed her. Her own arrogance had delivered her downfall. She wanted me gone. Yet here I sat steady and unbroken, while she stood in the ruins of the life she had tried to build, destroyed not by my hands, but by her own. When the house finally settled into silence again, and the last echoes of chaos faded into memory, I found myself standing in the kitchen with a single glass in my hand, the bottle of wine open before me, its cork resting on the counter like a discarded truth. I poured slowly, watching the red stream coil into the glass, pure and untainted, and I thought back to that night when the drink she offered me shimmered with menace, disguised as generosity. That party had been meant to mark the end of something, the close of my long career, a graceful step aside into a quieter life. Yet it became something far different, a revelation, a reminder that even in age, I could not be so easily pushed into shadows. People had toasted to my future, spoken of rest and peace. But I discovered instead that survival demands more than rest. It demands vigilance, and that the years which lined my face had not dulled the sharpness of my mind, or the instinct that has carried me through. She believed I was weak, that my trust could be turned against me, that my glass could be my undoing. But in the end, her cruelty had undone her, and left me standing here, steady and alive. I thought of the way she had smiled, certain she had written the final line of my story, and how with a single switch of 2 glasses, I had rewritten it, turning her weapon into her confession. My son now saw her for what she was, and though the fracture in his heart would take time to heal, I knew he would walk forward stronger, and perhaps with a clearer eye toward those who claim to love, while only seeking to possess. I raised the glass now, not in the crowded hall where speeches rang, but in the solitude of my kitchen, my own hand having poured it, my own eyes watching carefully the surface of the wine. I raised it to freedom, to the right to live without fear of those who scheme behind false smiles, to survival that is earned. And yes, to revenge, which tastes not sweet but bitter, the kind of bitterness that clears the tongue and leaves one awake. I drank deeply, savoring not just the wine, but the certainty that I had endured, and that the final glass was mine alone to claim.